The grand arbitration chamber of the hegemony floated in the void between star systems, a testament to bureaucratic excess that would make any government accountant weep tears of joy. Constructed from crystallized dark matter and powered by the death throes of 3 separate quasars, it served as the judicial heart of a galactic empire that had mastered the art of making paperwork literally deadly. The building itself was roughly the size of a small moon, because apparently when you control half the galaxy, subtlety becomes optional. Inside the main courtroom, a structure that could comfortably house several major cities, the Tribunal of Extinction Appeals was in session. The name alone should have been a red flag to anyone with functioning moral circuitry, but the hegemony had long ago discovered that calling something official-sounding made genocide feel like proper administrative procedure. Today's docket was refreshingly light. Only 17 species extinctions to review, 3 planetary sterilizations to approve, and 1 particularly tedious appeal from a civilization that insisted their sacred burial grounds shouldn't be strip-mined for antimatter fuel. Judge Arbitrator Vexthul presided from his floating dais, his crystalline exoskeleton refracting the chamber's bioluminescent lighting into a rainbow of bureaucratic authority. As a member of the Dominion caste, he possessed the natural ability to feel smugly superior about everything, while maintaining the emotional range of a particularly vindictive calculator. His 12 eyes scanned the day's proceedings with the enthusiasm of someone reviewing tax forms, which, considering the hegemony's approach to galactic governance, wasn't far from the truth. Case number 4780-21337, Vexthul intoned through his translator implant, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had personally overseen the administrative annihilation of more civilizations than most beings could count. Planetary cleansing Operation Sol 3, commonly designated as Earth by its former inhabitants. Standard pest control measures were implemented 6 standard cycles ago. Appeals period has expired without incident. The prosecutor, a gelatinous blob of sentient bureaucracy known as Enforcement Director Glubnex, rippled with satisfaction. Through the miracle of universal translation technology, his gaseous emissions were rendered into perfectly articulated legal. Your Excellence, this case represents a textbook example of efficient resource allocation. The target species demonstrated classic signs of terminal aggression, technological inconsistency, and an alarming tendency to reproduce without proper licensing. Standard extermination protocols were followed to the letter. Indeed, Earth's elimination had been refreshingly straightforward by hegemony standards. No messy negotiations, no tedious cultural preservation paperwork, no awkward diplomatic ceremonies where everyone pretended that orbital bombardment was really just aggressive urban renewal. The humans had been classified as a Type C infestation, technically sentient, but not sufficiently evolved to warrant the paperwork required for proper subjugation. It was the kind of clean, efficient genocide that made the hegemony's quarterly extinction reports look absolutely stellar. Defense advocate Warek, whose job description essentially boiled down to provide the legal minimum of opposition to maintain the illusion of justice, activated his hover platform with visible reluctance. As a professional defender of lost causes, he had perfected the art of zealous representation that somehow always managed to lose by exactly the margin required to keep the system functioning smoothly. Your Excellence, Warek began, his mandibles clicking in a pattern that conveyed dutiful resignation. While my clients are admittedly deceased, and therefore unable to appear for their own defense, I feel obligated to note that the species in question had achieved rudimentary spaceflight and had begun colonizing their immediate stellar neighborhood. Perhaps a more thorough evaluation period might have been. Objection. Glubnex bubbled with practiced indignation. The defense advocate is clearly unfamiliar with subsection 8-17b of the Galactic Cleansing Code, which explicitly states that any species showing signs of rapid technological advancement without corresponding social maturity is to be classified as a clear and present danger to galactic stability. The humans had nuclear weapons and reality television. Your Excellence, the math practically did itself. Vexthul's crystalline features arranged themselves into what passed for a judicial expression among his species, which looked remarkably like someone trying to solve a moderately difficult Sudoku puzzle while experiencing mild indigestion. The court recognizes the validity of the prosecution's argument. The defense's appeal lacks both legal merit and, more importantly, any living clients to benefit from a favorable ruling. The assembled gallery of various alien dignitaries and legal functionaries rippled with polite amusement. This was exactly the sort of open and shut case that made the hegemony's legal system function so smoothly. No messy complications, no unexpected survivors crawling out of the wreckage to complicate the paperwork, no awkward questions about the morality of exterminating entire civilizations for the crime of existing without permission. The tribunal's AI system, which had been designed by a species that viewed due process as a charming but inefficient anachronism, began processing the routine closure documents. In approximately 14 minutes, the case would be officially sealed. Earth would be formally redesignated as Reclaimed Resource Zone 7749 Delta, and everyone could move on to the next item on the docket, which promised to be equally straightforward. After all, what could possibly complicate the legal aftermath of a thoroughly successful planetary extermination? The humans were gone, their cities were vapor, their monuments were space dust, and their entire solar system had been sterilized with the kind of thoroughness that made Hegemony Military Academy cadets weep with professional pride. It was, by every measurable standard, a perfect example of how the galaxy's dominant civilization maintained order through the simple expedient of removing disorder entirely. The only sound in the vast chamber was the gentle humming of the life support systems and the soft clicking of bureaucratic mandibles, as various functionaries prepared to rubber stamp another successful genocide. Peace, order, and the complete absence of inconvenient survivors. Exactly the way the hegemony preferred to conduct business. Then, with the casual timing of someone who had clearly never read the hegemony's official handbook on appropriate moments for dramatic entrances, reality decided to develop a sense of humor. The air in the center of the courtroom began to shimmer like a heat mirage over crystallized bureaucracy. This was immediately concerning for several reasons, not least of which was that the chamber's environmental controls were calibrated to prevent such inconveniences as atmospheric disturbances, unauthorized teleportation, and the spontaneous manifestation of anything that might complicate the legal proceeding. The hegemony had learned, through several embarrassing incidents involving vengeful space gods and very angry filing clerks, that courtrooms worked best when the laws of physics remained consistently cooperative. Vexthuel's 12 eyes swiveled toward the disturbance with the sort of mechanical precision that suggested either excellent cybernetic enhancement or the gradual replacement of organic curiosity with judicial irritation. Bailiff, please investigate that unauthorized spatial anomaly and file the appropriate paperwork for its immediate removal. The bailiff, a towering creature whose species had evolved specifically to excel at intimidating people through bureaucratic menace, approached the shimmer with the confident stride of someone who had dealt with far stranger interruptions. His multiple arms were already reaching for the various forms required to cite reality itself for contempt of court when the anomaly decided to stop being polite about its existence. Light bent in ways that made the chamber's geometric sensors file error reports in 17 different mathematical languages. Space folded with the sound of cosmic origami being assembled by someone with absolutely no patience for instruction manual. And then, with the sort of understated entrance that would have been deeply disappointing to anyone expecting dramatic special effects, a figure materialized in the exact center of the courtroom. She stood there with the casual poise of someone who had just stepped through a perfectly ordinary door, rather than torn a hole in the fabric of space-time itself. Human, unmistakably so, though the assembled aliens might have been forgiven for not immediately recognizing the species, since they had spent considerable effort ensuring that no living examples remained in the galaxy. Her appearance was unremarkable by the standards of her extinct people: medium height, standard bipedal configuration, the sort of symmetrical features that suggested her ancestors had been reasonably successful at not dying before reproducing. What was remarkable in a way that sent the chamber's various scanning devices into paroxysms of technological confusion was that she was clearly, indisputably and impossibly alive. The silence that followed could have been packaged and sold as a premium grade of awkwardness to civilizations that specialized in uncomfortable diplomatic incidents. It was the sort of silence that occurred when an entire room full of beings suddenly realized that their fundamental understanding of reality had developed a significant clerical error. Glubnex was the first to recover, his gelatinous form rippling with the sort of agitation typically reserved for tax audits and surprise inspections from the Galactic Ethics Committee. Security brief. he announced with all the authority of someone whose entire worldview was currently being audited by the universe itself. Unauthorized presence in a restricted judicial facility. Possible contamination of sterile legal proceeding. The woman turned toward him with the patient expression of someone who had been expecting exactly this sort of reception. When she spoke, her words were rendered through the universal translation matrix with perfect clarity, though several of the more sensitive devices registered undertones that suggested the technology was working much harder than usual. "Oh, please continue," she said, her voice carrying the sort of calm politeness that made seasoned diplomats reach for their emergency anxiety medications. "I wouldn't want to interrupt such fascinating legal proceeding. I'm particularly interested in the part where you casually discuss the administrative details of exterminating my entire species." Vexthal's crystalline features rearranged themselves into a configuration that his species used to indicate extreme judicial displeasure mixed with the growing suspicion that someone had forgotten to file the proper extinction verification document. "Impossible," he declared with the sort of finality typically reserved for fundamental constants of physics. Sol 3 was completely sterilized. All biological matter was reduced to component atoms. The energy signatures were confirmed through standard post-cleansing protocol. "Yes, I saw the reports," the human replied, and the casual way she mentioned having access to classified hegemony military documents sent a wave of nervous chittering through the gallery. "Quite thorough, actually. I particularly appreciated the detailed calculations on atmospheric ionization. Someone clearly spent a lot of time making sure that every single living thing on that planet was completely, utterly, and irreversibly dead." She paused, examining her fingernails with the sort of idle attention that suggested she was considering whether they needed trimming. "Imagine my surprise when I discovered that every single living thing had somehow failed to include me." The chamber's security systems, which had been designed to handle everything from armed rebellion to unauthorized poetry recitals, began registering readings that violated several basic principles of xenobiology. The scanners were detecting biological signatures that shouldn't exist, energy patterns that contradicted established physics, and what appeared to be someone casually discussing their own impossible survival with all the emotional investment of someone reviewing their grocery list. Defense advocate Warwick, whose professional instincts had been honed by decades of representing clients in cases where inevitable defeat was considered an optimistic. What followed was a masterclass in the sort of revelation that made entire civilizations reevaluate their life choices, delivered with the casual confidence of someone explaining why their restaurant order was incorrect. The human walked slowly around the courtroom, her footsteps echoing with a sound that somehow managed to suggest that she was far more substantial than the building containing her. "You know what's fascinating about your extermination protocols?" she began, addressing the room with the tone of a particularly patient teacher, explaining basic mathematics to students who had somehow managed to divide by zero. "They're incredibly thorough when it comes to destroying planets. Truly impressive work. The orbital bombardment patterns were textbook perfect. The atmospheric ignition was beautifully calculated, and the molecular disintegration field coverage was absolutely comprehensive." Vexthal's crystalline form had begun to emit a low harmonic frequency that his species typically reserved for moments of extreme judicial uncertainty. The sterilization was confirmed through multiple independent verification systems. No biological matter could have survived the process. "It is physically impossible." "Oh, absolutely." The human agreed with the sort of cheerful enthusiasm typically reserved for complimenting someone's choice in home decoration. "No biological matter from Earth could have survived what you did to that poor little planet. The energy levels involved were quite beyond anything a primitive species like humanity could possibly withstand. Your calculations were flawless. Your execution was perfect. And your post-operation verification procedures were admirably thorough." She paused at the prosecutor's station, where gloobnecks had begun rippling in patterns that suggested either extreme agitation or the onset of a particularly severe case of bureaucratic dyspepsia. "There's just one tiny little problem with your entire approach to pest control." The chamber's advanced sensor arrays, which had been designed by a coalition of species that prided themselves on their ability to measure anything from quantum fluctuations to the precise emotional state of dying stars, were registering readings that made no sense according to any known branch of science. The human appeared to be simultaneously present and absent, corporeal and incorporeal, alive and something that transcended such limited biological category. You assumed, she continued, her voice carrying undertones that made the universal translators work overtime to convey concepts that apparently didn't exist in most galactic languages, that the primitive little civilization you found on Earth represented the full extent of human achievement. That was your first mistake. Defense advocate Werrick's mandibles had stopped clicking entirely, locked in a position that conveyed the sort of stunned comprehension typically experienced by beings who suddenly realized they had been playing a game without understanding the rules. Are you suggesting, he managed to articulate through his species' equivalent of barely controlled panic, that the human civilization we observed was not representative of your species' actual capability? The woman's laugh was the sort of sound that made hardened military strategists reconsider their career choices. Representative? Oh, that's wonderful. You discovered a single world where we had established what you might call a nature preserve, a place where we could experience what it was like to live simply, to pretend we were still bound by the limitations of planetary existence. We called it the Garden Project. The implications of this statement began to percolate through the assembled aliens with the speed and subtlety of a supernova in a library. The gallery erupted in a cacophony of clicks, whistles, gurgles, and the sort of multi-dimensional screaming that could only be produced by species whose vocal cords existed in several different phases of matter simultaneously. Gloobnecks bubbled with the sort of desperate authority that characterized beings whose entire worldview was currently being dissolved in cosmic acid. Our surveys were comprehensive. We mapped your entire technological infrastructure. Your species had barely achieved crude spaceflight. Your weapons were primitive chemical explosives. Your energy systems were dependent on burning dead organic matter. Yes, we went to considerable trouble to maintain that illusion, the human replied, examining the chamber's elaborate crystalline architecture with the sort of casual interest that suggested she was evaluating it for potential redecoration. It's remarkably difficult to convincingly portray a primitive civilization when your actual technology base operates on principles that most galactic species wouldn't recognize as physics. Do you have any idea how challenging it is to pretend that faster-than-light travel is beyond your capabilities, when your children use dimensional manipulation as a form of recreational mathematics? The chamber's reality stabilizers, which had been installed after an unfortunate incident involving a species that could argue with the laws of thermodynamics and wind, began registering fluctuations that suggested local spacetime was developing opinions about the proceeding. Emergency protocols activated as the building's structural integrity systems detected that something in the courtroom was exerting forces that shouldn't exist according to several fundamental theories of universal construction. The real trick, the human continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that her mere presence was causing an architectural crisis, was maintaining the pretense for so many centuries. We had to carefully limit our apparent technological development, suppress any evidence of our actual capabilities, and resist the urge to fix your various galactic problems for you. Do you know how frustrating it is to watch entire star systems destroy themselves through warfare when you could solve their conflicts with what your children would consider basic social engineering? Vexthal's 12 eyes had arranged themselves in a pattern that his species used to indicate complete judicial breakdown, mixed with the growing certainty that someone had forgotten to inform him that the universe operated according to entirely different rules than he had been taught. What are you saying? That your species deliberately concealed advanced technological capabilities while maintaining a facade of primitive development? Advanced? The human's eyebrows rose with the sort of polite surprise that made seasoned diplomats reach for strong intoxicant. Oh, you flatter us. We're still practically infants compared to some of the elder species. We've barely figured out how to exist in more than 47 dimensions simultaneously. Our understanding of temporal mechanics is embarrassingly limited. We can only navigate through about 12 different probability streams at once. And don't get me started on our crude approach to consciousness multiplication. She gestured toward the chamber's elaborate sensor arrays, which had begun displaying readings that appeared to be written in mathematical languages that didn't exist yet. But we've learned enough to recognize a test when we see one. You see, we've been watching your hegemony for quite some time, studying your approach to galactic governance, analyzing your methods for dealing with species you consider inferior. We were particularly interested in your protocols for planetary sterilization. The silence that followed was the sort that typically preceded either profound enlightenment or complete civilizational collapse, and from the expressions on the various alien faces throughout the chamber, it appeared that both outcomes were currently being considered as equally probable. The human moved to the center of the courtroom with the unhurried pace of someone who had all the time in the universe, which, given what she had just revealed about her species' relationship with temporal mechanics, was probably a more literal statement than anyone in the chamber found comfortable. She stood beneath the massive judicial seal of the hegemony, a symbol that had presided over the legal dissolution of more civilizations than most beings could count, and somehow managed to make it look quaint. "So here's what's going to happen," she announced with the sort of calm authority that made the chamber's artificial intelligence systems begin composing resignation letters. "I'm going to present you with a choice. It's the same choice you've given to countless species across the galaxy, though I suspect you'll find the circumstances somewhat different when you're on the receiving end." Vexthal's crystalline form had begun emitting harmonics that his species typically reserved for religious experiences, or complete psychological breakdown. "You cannot simply dictate terms to the hegemony. We are the supreme judicial authority for 3/4 of the galaxy. Our military forces, your military forces," the human interrupted with the patient tone of someone correcting a child's arithmetic, "are currently experiencing what your tactical manuals would classify as a comprehensive strategic recalibration. Every single one of your warships, battle stations and planetary defense systems has been simultaneously visited by representatives of my species. They're not destroyed. We're not quite as fond of wholesale slaughter as you appear to be, but I'm afraid they're no longer capable of fulfilling their intended function." She gestured casually toward the chamber's main display system, which immediately began showing real-time feeds from across the hegemony's military infrastructure. The images that appeared made several of the alien dignitaries emit sounds typically associated with witnessing the heat death of the universe in fast forward. Every weapon in the hegemony's vast arsenal had been transformed. Massive planet-cracking cannons now sprouted elaborate gardens that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. City-sized battle cruisers had been converted into what appeared to be mobile art galleries, showcasing sculptures that hurt to look at direct. Fortress worlds designed to withstand supernovas were now covered in structures that resembled children's playgrounds, if children's playgrounds had been designed by beings who considered the laws of physics to be helpful suggestions rather than absolute constraints. The good news, the human continued as the assembled aliens processed the complete strategic nullification of their entire civilization, is that nobody was harmed during the process. We even improved the efficiency of your life support systems while we were there. Consider it a courtesy upgrade. Glubnex had begun rippling in patterns that suggested his gelatinous form was attempting to achieve escape velocity from the general vicinity of this conversation. "This is impossible. Our technology is the most advanced in the galaxy. Our weapons were designed by the greatest military minds of 50 different species. Yes, and it's all very impressive for a Type K civilization." The human agreed with the sort of encouraging tone typically used when praising a toddler's crayon artwork. "You've made remarkable progress considering you're still primarily operating in 3 dimensions with linear temporal perception. Give yourselves another few thousand years and you might even figure out how to manipulate matter at the quantum level without those adorable little particle accelerators." The chamber's emergency systems had begun implementing protocols designed for scenarios that the architects had never expected to encounter, such as reality is being rewritten by someone who finds physical laws inconvenient, and the fundamental nature of existence has filed a complaint. Warning lights flashed in colors that didn't appear on any known spectrum, while alarms sounded frequencies that technically shouldn't exist. "Now about that choice I mentioned," the human said, her voice somehow remaining perfectly audible, despite the fact that the chamber's acoustic systems had given up trying to understand how sound waves were propagating through space that had apparently decided to ignore Euclidean geometry. "Option 1. You can continue operating exactly as you have been, making decisions about which species deserve to exist based on your rather limited understanding of galactic development. Of course you'll be doing so under the supervision of beings who view your current approach to civilization with roughly the same enthusiasm that you reserved for humanity's existence." She paused, allowing the implications to settle like cosmic sediment in the minds of beings whose entire worldview had just been subjected to industrial-strength reality adjustment. Option 2, you can begin the rather lengthy process of learning how to coexist with species that don't conform to your expectations of appropriate development. This would involve abandoning your policy of preemptive extinction in favor of what more mature civilizations call basic diplomatic courtesy. Defense advocate Warwick, whose professional instincts had been developed during centuries of losing cases with mathematical precision, found himself in the unprecedented position of potentially winning an argument through the simple expedient of representing clients who had turned out to be functionally omnipotent. And if the hegemony chooses neither option, the human smile contained enough implications to power a small star. Well, that would be unfortunate. You see, we've grown rather fond of this galaxy over the past few million years. It's where we keep our things, and we've become somewhat protective of the younger species that are still learning how to exist without destroying themselves or their neighbors. She gestured toward the assembled court with the casual authority of someone who had apparently been appointed by the universe itself to serve as a cosmic quality control inspector. Consider this your performance review. Your approach to galactic governance has been evaluated by beings whose understanding of existence operates on principles that your most advanced theoretical physicists would find conceptually challenging. The results were less than optimal. The Great Chamber of the Hegemony, designed to project the awesome authority of a civilization that had conquered half the galaxy through superior firepower and bureaucratic efficiency, suddenly felt remarkably small. It was the sort of perspective adjustment typically experienced by beings who discovered that their impressive planetary empire was actually located inside someone's decorative terrarium. The irony, the human concluded with the sort of satisfied observation typically reserved for the punchlines of cosmic jokes, is that you spent so much energy eliminating species you considered dangerous, that you never bothered to identify the ones that might actually pose a threat to your existence. You destroyed our little garden world because you were afraid of what humanity might become, never realizing that what we had already become was far beyond your ability to comprehend, let alone eliminate. She turned toward the exit, pausing only to add, "The paperwork for your species' continued existence will be filed under probationary status pending behavioral improvement. Try not to disappoint us." And with that, she stepped through what appeared to be perfectly normal air, but somehow managed to be elsewhere, leaving behind a courtroom full of beings who had just discovered that their position as apex predators of the galaxy had been subject to revision by entities that found their entire civilization quaint. The silence that remained was the sort that typically followed the realization that the universe had a sense of humor, and it wasn't always kind.